Grigori Rasputin was a Russian peasant who claimed to have mystic healing powers, and he even went so far as to say that he was the second coming of Christ. He formed his own cult and even manipulated members of the royal Romanov family into believing that he truly was a holy man. Once he had everyone wrapped around his little finger, he used his influence over the Russian government, and his decisions contributed to the downfall of the Romanov dynasty.
In the frozen silence of a Russian winter night, a single man walked unknowingly into a trap that would make history. He was feared, hated, and worshipped all at once. His name was Rasputin, the so-called holy man whose power over Russia's royal family pushed a nation to the edge. That night, poison was poured.
As a boy, he claimed that he would have visions of the future and that angels appeared to him in his dreams. He knew things about his neighbors that he couldn't possibly know, which was enough evidence to make the locals believe him. He could heal horses who were sick just by touching them. Some villagers believed that he was the second coming of Christ and that he was simply touched by God.
Pistols were loaded, and powerful men prepared to do whatever it took to end him. What followed was one of the most unbelievable assassination attempts the world has ever known. To understand why a group of influential men would go to such extreme lengths to bring down Rasputin, we need to go back to his beginnings. His story is one of the most unusual rises to power in modern history. Born in 1869 in a small peasant village in Siberia, Rasputin had very little going for him at the start. He grew up in poverty, could not read or write, and was expected to live a simple life working the land like generations before him. He married young, started a family, and for a while there was nothing remarkable about him. He was just another man in a remote Russian village, leading a predictable rural life. But around the age of 28, something shifted. Rasputin underwent a deep religious transformation. He left behind his wife and children, setting out on a pilgrimage across Russia. During his travels, he developed a reputation for being unusually spiritual and charismatic. He began gathering small groups of followers who prayed with him, listened to his teachings, and believed in his ability to heal. His presence made an impression wherever he went. Priests, villagers, and even skeptics found themselves captivated by him. He had a strange kind of magnetism that people couldn't ignore. As he moved from place to place, Rasputin's reputation grew. By the early 1900s, he was known not only as a wandering holy man, but also as someone with the power to heal the sick. In a country where medical knowledge was still limited for ordinary people, this kind of reputation spread quickly. By 1905, Rasputin's name was being spoken in circles far beyond the villages of Siberia. His rise would soon take him into the most powerful household in Russia, the imperial family. At the heart of this was the health of Tsarevich Alexei, the son of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra. The boy suffered from hemophilia, a serious and life-threatening condition that caused uncontrolled bleeding. At the time, medicine had no effective cure, and the child's condition was a constant source of fear for his parents. The Empress, deeply religious and desperate to save her son, turned to Rasputin after hearing of his supposed healing powers. When Rasputin first visited the royal family, he did something surprising. He advised that the boy stop taking certain medications, prayed intensely for him, and according to reports, Alexei's condition improved shortly after. Whether this was coincidence, a psychological effect, or something else entirely, it left a powerful impression on the Empress. To her, Rasputin had performed a miracle. From that moment on, Rasputin was no longer just a wandering preacher. He was a trusted advisor and healer, with direct access to the Russian throne. His position within the royal circle gave him extraordinary influence. The Empress saw him as a man sent by God, someone who could guide her and protect her family. She turned to him often, not only for matters of health, but also for advice on politics and personal decisions. This closeness, however, created suspicion and resentment among many in Russian society. The idea that a peasant from Siberia could wield such power over the Empress, and by extension the Tsar, was unthinkable for the aristocracy. For ordinary Russians, it was even worse. Many saw Rasputin not as a holy man, but as a manipulative fraud who was corrupting the monarchy from within. The controversy around him only grew as more details of his private life came to light. Far from being a man of discipline and restraint, Rasputin was known to drink heavily, party late into the night, and have numerous affairs. He was surrounded by women, many of them drawn to his reputation as a healer and spiritual figure, but his behavior shocked the conservative society of the time. In 1915, the Russian secret police began secretly following Rasputin. Their surveillance revealed what critics had long suspected. He spent many nights with prostitutes, attended wild parties, and regularly returned home in the early hours of the morning, often drunk. Reports from these investigations painted a picture of a man who lived a life of excess while still maintaining his image as a religious figure and confidant of the Empress. Despite this double life, Rasputin's influence only grew. His closeness to the Empress allowed him to weigh in on political decisions. He began appointing ministers, advising on war strategies, and using his position to shape the government in ways that alarmed the nobility and angered the public. The perception spread that the royal family, particularly the Empress, was under his control. Some even believed that Rasputin was deliberately weakening Russia for his own gain. The timing could not have been worse. Russia was already facing massive internal unrest. The First World War was draining resources, causing casualties, and fueling dissatisfaction with the monarchy. In this climate, Rasputin became the perfect symbol of everything that was wrong. To many Russians, he was the face of corruption, incompetence, and spiritual deception. By 1916, the hatred toward him had reached its peak. Newspapers, despite heavy censorship, began publishing stories about his influence over the royal family. Even though editors faced fines and punishment for breaking the rules, they were willing to take the risk. Public opinion had turned decisively against Rasputin. For many, he was no longer just a scandalous figure, he had become a national threat. That November, the growing resentment spilled over into the political arena. During a session of the Russian parliament, politician Vladimir Prushkevich openly condemned Rasputin, calling out his influence and the damage it was causing to the monarchy and the country. This was one of the first times someone in such a position had dared to speak so openly about him. It was a turning point. In the audience that day was Prince Felix Yusupov, a wealthy aristocrat and member of one of the richest families in Russia. For Yusupov, hearing Prushkevich's speech was a confirmation of what he already believed. Rasputin was dangerous, and his presence at the heart of power threatened the very survival of Russia. From that moment, Yusupov became determined to act. The stage was set. Rasputin had risen from obscurity in Siberia to become one of the most powerful men in Russia. He had earned the trust of the Empress, gained influence in politics, and made countless enemies along the way. His behavior, both public and private, had created a storm of anger and suspicion that would not die down. And in the final months of 1916, that storm would push a group of men to take matters into their own hands. By late 1916, the tension around Rasputin had reached breaking point. Politicians, members of the royal family, and sections of the public all believed that the only way to save Russia was to remove him. His influence on the Empress was viewed as dangerous, his behavior scandalous, and his hold over the monarchy untenable. The atmosphere was one of frustration and urgency. Something had to be done, and for several men in positions of power, that meant a plot to end Rasputin's life once and for all. One of the key figures who stepped forward was Prince Felix Yusupov. Born into one of the wealthiest families in Russia, Yusupov was well-connected, young, and ambitious. He despised Rasputin, seeing him as a corrupting force at the heart of Russian politics. For Yusupov, this wasn't only about personal disgust. He believed that Rasputin's influence over the Empress threatened the survival of the monarchy itself. The more control Rasputin seemed to exercise, the weaker the authority of the Tsar appeared to be in the eyes of the people. Yusupov became convinced that eliminating Rasputin was the only way to restore stability and credibility. After hearing the bold denunciation of Rasputin in parliament by Vladimir Prushkevich, Yusupov reached out to him. Prushkevich, a right-wing politician and loyal monarchist, had already made his hatred of Rasputin public. When Yusupov contacted him, it was immediately clear that they shared the same goal. It did not take long before the two began discussing what could be done. Their conversations quickly moved from complaints to concrete plans for action. The plan to kill Rasputin was formed during a meeting on board Prushkevich's train. It was parked at a station near St. Petersburg, and inside, away from prying eyes, a group gathered to discuss the details. Alongside Yusupov and Prushkevich were Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of Tsar Nicholas II, Dr. Stanislaus Lazavert, a military doctor, and Lieutenant Sergei Sukotin. This group, made up of men from both the aristocracy and the military, shared the same determination. They believed that by removing Rasputin, they would not only protect the monarchy, but also save Russia from further decline. Together, they mapped out a step-by-step assassination plan. On the chosen night, Rasputin would be lured to Yusupov's palace under false pretenses. Once there, he would be taken to a basement dining room that had been prepared for the occasion. The thick concrete walls would ensure that no noise, whether raised voices, screams, or gunshots, could be heard from outside. The setting was carefully chosen to provide secrecy and control. The weapon of choice for the first stage of the plot was poison. Dr. Lazavert was tasked with preparing cakes and wine laced with cyanide, one of the most deadly substances known at the time. The idea was simple: Rasputin would be served poisoned food and drink, and within 15 minutes he would be dead. No guns, no noise, no mess. It was supposed to be quick, silent, and clean. Once Rasputin was dead, his body would be removed and disposed of in such a way that it would never be found. The conspirators agreed to destroy his clothes, burn what evidence they could, and finally throw his body into the river under the cover of night. But before all of that, there was one major challenge: convincing Rasputin to come to the palace. This would fall to Yusupov himself. He began by visiting Rasputin on several occasions, pretending to need his healing powers. Yusupov even faked chest pains to gain Rasputin's trust and make their meeting seem genuine. Over time, Rasputin believed that Yusupov had become one of his close friends. This new friendship would be the bait. There was another part of the lure. Rasputin, well known for his attraction to women, was eager to meet Yusupov's wife, Irina. She was young, beautiful, and part of the aristocracy, which made her all the more appealing to him. Yusupov played on this desire, telling Rasputin that Irina would be hosting a small gathering at their palace and inviting him to attend. For Rasputin, the chance to meet Irina was irresistible. He agreed to come to the palace on the night of December 29, 1916. The trap was set. The details of the night were planned down to the minute. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, Yusupov and Dr. Lazavert, disguised as a chauffeur, would pick Rasputin up and bring him to the palace. The car would be parked in such a way that Rasputin's arrival would not be noticed by anyone outside. The conspirators knew that Rasputin was under constant surveillance from multiple security agencies. They assumed spies might be watching his movements, so secrecy was crucial. Once inside, Dr. Lazavert would join the others upstairs, while Yusupov entertained Rasputin in the basement. As Rasputin ate and drank, the poisoned food was supposed to do the work. When he collapsed, the conspirators would wait until they were sure he was dead. Then they would begin disposing of the evidence. Entered board, Eklov, and Dewark. First, his clothes would be burned in the stove on board Prushkevich's train. The car used to transport him would be hidden in a cargo wagon, ready to leave the city. The men would then return by foot to another vehicle and collect Rasputin's body. Finally, they would carry him to a bridge, weigh him down, and throw him into the freezing river. It was an elaborate plan, but one they believed would solve the problem once and for all. As with many plans, however, reality was bound to complicate things. Even before the night itself, the conspirators were aware of the risks. Rasputin was protected, watched, and feared. His reputation for surviving illnesses and injuries made some of the men nervous. Still, they pushed forward, convinced that it had to be done. In modern terms, the planning of this assassination almost resembled a carefully managed project. Different men had different roles, deadlines were set, and the success of the entire operation depended on each part working together smoothly. To keep such a complex plan on track would have been a challenge even in business, let alone in a dangerous political assassination. Today, tools like management software exist to coordinate efforts, streamline communication, and reduce the risk of mistakes. Back then, all they had was trust in each other and the determination to follow through, no matter what happened. By the final days of December, everything was in place. Rasputin believed he was heading to meet Yusupov's wife at a private party. Yusupov and his co-conspirators believed they had designed the perfect trap. In their minds, within hours, Rasputin would be gone, and Russia would finally be free of his influence. What they did not know was that the night ahead would not go as smoothly as they expected. Instead of being quick and clean, the assassination of Rasputin would become one of the most dramatic and chaotic murder attempts in modern history. The night of the assassination finally arrived. It was bitterly cold in St. Petersburg, and by 11 in the evening the streets were empty. The conspirators had agreed on every step of the plan, and now it was time to put it into action. Prushkevich left his train around 11:15 and waited anxiously to be collected. Almost half an hour later, Dr. Lazavert pulled up in a car, disguised as a chauffeur. Together they drove through the quiet streets toward Yusupov's palace. When they arrived, the conspirators faced their first problem. The side gate, which had been chosen for a discreet entrance, was locked. They had to circle the palace before eventually slipping inside. Upstairs, the rest of the group gathered nervously, while downstairs the basement had been turned into a lavish dining room. Cakes and glasses of red wine sat on the table, each one laced with cyanide. Everything was prepared. The only thing missing was Rasputin. Back at his home, Rasputin was getting ready for what he believed would be a pleasant evening. Despite being advised to keep his plans quiet, he mentioned the party to his daughter and his secretary. He had no idea that he was walking into a carefully prepared trap. Around midnight, Yusupov and Dr. Lazavert drove to collect him, and by about 12:45 the car pulled up at the palace. Rasputin stepped inside, greeted warmly, and was led down into the basement where the food and wine were waiting. Upstairs, the other conspirators listened carefully for any sounds from below. They expected the poison to take effect quickly, but Rasputin refused the cakes at first. Time dragged on as Yusupov tried to coax him into eating. Eventually, Rasputin drank some wine and tasted the food. Half an hour passed, then another. Nothing happened. Instead of collapsing, Rasputin remained alive, talking casually as if nothing were wrong. Yusupov went upstairs several times to tell the others that the poison wasn't working. They could hardly believe it. After more than an hour of waiting, Yusupov lost patience. He picked up a pistol, returned to the basement, and fired at Rasputin. The shot struck him, and he collapsed onto the floor. Believing their plan had finally succeeded, the conspirators began to move on to the next stage. Some left for the train to burn his clothes, while others stayed behind. But then something extraordinary happened. Rasputin, who was supposed to be dead, staggered back onto his feet and tried to escape. He pushed through the courtyard and headed toward the gate. Prushkevich chased after him with a revolver. He fired several times, missing at first, before finally hitting Rasputin in the back. Rasputin fell into the snow, gasping, and at last the group believed he was finished. His body was carried back inside the palace and wrapped in a curtain. The conspirators were shaken. The poisoning had failed, and even shooting him had taken longer than expected. Their neat, silent plan had turned into a chaotic and noisy affair. They tried to return to their original plan of covering their tracks. Some of the men carried his clothes to the train, but the stove was too small to burn them completely. Meanwhile, soldiers stationed nearby saw what was happening, and rather than intervening, congratulated the conspirators. Hatred of Rasputin was so widespread that even guards were relieved to hear he had finally been killed. In the early hours of the morning, the group drove Rasputin's body out of the city. At the Petrovsky Bridge, they tied weights to him and dropped him through a hole in the ice into the freezing river. By then it was nearly dawn, and the men returned to their homes exhausted and unsettled. The assassination had been far more complicated and dramatic than they had ever intended. But their efforts to hide the crime were clumsy. Blood stains remained in the courtyard of the palace, and one of Rasputin's boots was left behind. Within 2 days, his body was discovered frozen in the river. Police quickly realized who had been involved. Everyone knew Rasputin had gone to Yusupov's palace that night, and the conspirators had done little to disguise their movements. Despite the clear evidence, Tsar Nicholas decided not to punish them harshly. Russia was already unstable, and he feared that arrests might make matters worse. Even so, the plotters did not escape consequences. Some, like Pavlovich, Dr. Lozovert, and Lieutenant Sukhostin, left Russia soon after. Pershkevich remained but died, only a few years later. Yusupov, the prince who had drawn Rasputin into the trap, was exiled. He lived the rest of his life in France with his wife Irina, far removed from the power and wealth he had once known. The assassination of Rasputin quickly became one of the most famous in history. His extraordinary survival after being poisoned, shot, and left for dead gave rise to legends about his resilience. Some believed he had mystical powers that made him nearly impossible to kill. Others saw it as proof of his remarkable physical strength and will to live. Whatever the explanation, the events of that night cemented his reputation as a man who defied expectations until the very end. For Russia, however, his death did little to solve the problems that had inspired the plot. Within months, the monarchy itself collapsed during the February Revolution of 1917. The conspirators who had risked everything to remove Rasputin found that their actions had not saved the empire after all. Instead, the Romanovs were overthrown, and Russia entered one of the most turbulent periods in its history.